All right, now we start. Hi, everyone. Hi. Okay. Great. Thanks for the timer. Very clear time rolling. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Melissa Malzkuhn, and I am third generation deaf. That means that I grew up a part of the deaf community. That means I was born having access to language. American Sign Language is my native language. I went to schools with other deaf children, so very much a part of the deaf community. In my work and my personal journey, my work has included over 20 years of advocacy work on a personal and professional level. I focus on sign language access for deaf children. So I still do work in that vein, but that really led me to other areas where I focus on encouraging deaf leadership among young deaf people, supporting deaf families. I work at Gallaudet University, based in Washington, D.C., in the United States, and I'm here at the summit because this topic is really so important for deaf people. When I've talked with others from the foundation, I realize just how much that when we talk about financial inclusion, we don't necessarily all have the same definition of what inclusion means or what comes to mind when we talk about financial inclusion. So I think that we need to broaden what our definitions are. Also, we need to understand what the data is. We don't have much data about deaf people's financial inclusion or financial experiences. So there's a lot of gaps in data and what is actually known about the deaf community's financial inclusion. So I'm here to share some of my own anecdotes and experience and hopefully share some questions that can elevate the conversation about what it means to have financial inclusion for the deaf community. Figured I would start off with some context, specifically numbers, so you'd have a sense of what I mean when I say deaf community. We total about 450 million deaf people. There are 2 billion disabled people globally. So when you figure out the stats, it translates to about 450 million deaf. Some are born deaf. Some become deaf later in life. Some are born deaf, but their families don't know it until they're a little bit older. Some deaf people learn sign languages later in life. Some are born into families that sign. So every deaf person has a bit of a different journey. And deaf people, wherever there is a deaf person, there should or will be a sign language. There are over 300 documented sign languages in use around the world. Many people have the misconception that sign language is universal, but nothing is universal with humans around the world, so every deaf community has their own sign language. And when I say documented, what I mean is that these are 300 sign languages that have a dictionary. Dictionary efforts used to be based more on illustrations. People would try their best to draw signs that people used. Today, obviously, we have technology that allows us to video the sign. You can see how it actually is formed. Linguists do a lot of this research, so that's why we have so many that are documented. In 2023, 76 countries were counted as having legal recognition of their national sign languages. And the reason that this is so important is because that recognition usually is a precursor to having human rights. So that would mean that these deaf people in these countries would have access to any kind of information in their country, presidential announcements, any sort of press conferences, vital information that is in audio. So a lot of information is available in text, but sometimes the most important pressing information is only available in audio or is first available in audio. So having sign languages be recognized is really key to human rights. There are a number of sign language, organizations that push for legal recognition of sign languages, but as of this year, only 76 countries have recognized their sign languages nationally, and that's out of the 300 that are documented. A little more context, about 95% of deaf people are born into hearing families, so they have hearing parents, and that means that these families are often confronted with the need to learn how to communicate with their child, which hopefully translates into learning sign languages. And so many of them face a very new journey. And we have resources to support these families and programs, but there's a lot of gaps in how they're connected with the resources. So that's part of what I'm working on. A very high percentage of these families never learn to sign. About 80 to 85% of them never learn to sign. And only about 2 to 3% of deaf children worldwide get bilingual education, meaning they communicate with the adults in their school in person using a sign language, but they are exposed to reading and writing the print language of their country. So what this translates to in terms of barriers for access and success is that interpreters are often really vital, but who pays for them? Where do you find them? A lot of countries, if they don't recognize the sign language that's used by their deaf community, then there aren't interpreter training programs. So there's a lot of situations that are all interrelated for deaf people, and it ties into their access. For those of you in the room today, I know that you're thinking about finance a lot this week. And when you think about what you know about finance, some of it comes from household conversations. You see your parents talk about money, you hear them talk about money. Deaf people are a lot of times excluded from those sorts of family conversations. Remember the stat I just shared, that 80 to 85% of parents never learn to sign, so they don't pick up on those conversations that they might overhear otherwise. Also, a high number of deaf people are defrauded. So deaf people are scammed based on affinity with others who are trying to scam them. So if they're deaf themselves or if they're signers, they're more vulnerable to affinity fraud because of a high level of trust with other insiders. And they don't often have access to financial literacy information, so financial literacy is relatively low. And that is partly what relates to this propensity to be scammed. A couple other points specifically around finance. Now, I can't speak globally, but in the US, 53% of deaf people are employed, which is in comparison to 75% of their hearing counterparts. And so a lot of deaf people, part of why they aren't employed is because they have a hard time finding a job or being hired. Sometimes this is a cascading effect from the lack of early language exposure with their families. And generational wealth among deaf people is very rare, almost non-existent. There's conversely a lot more stories about deaf people that come from wealthy hearing families, but then other hearing family members take advantage of them, and without their knowledge or consent, take away their inheritances. And the assumption is, oh, well, they're deaf, they don't know what to do, they won't know how to manage their money. So there's a lot of stories like this where deaf people have lost out on money that was rightly owed to them because another family member took it from them. And again, because of the lack of concrete data, some of what I'm sharing is anecdotal, but there is certainly enough information about deaf people's involvement in finance, and we see that there's not enough financial literacy for there to be plenty of stories of success. So I know I've painted a pretty dismal picture so far, but it does not have to be that way. This is at least how I feel. I'm tired of these negative stories. I know that there are resources out there, resources like the Interledger Foundation. So it's a matter of making connections and building bridges so that the information can be spread among the deaf community. So now, a contradiction to this dismal picture I just painted about the deaf community is to look instead at a broader economy that's considered the signing economy. So we have a numeric value. This signing economy has been calculated to be worth about $3 billion. This is calculated as including businesses that have been set up by deaf people, businesses that then include deaf people in a very purposeful way in their audience. And it's estimated to be $3 to $10 billion in value to the US. This was calculated by Gallaudet University, again, where I work. So deaf schools, programs, audiologists, there are entire industries that promote sign language and that work with deaf people. And so this is valued, again, at a number in the billions, all surrounding deaf people and sign language. But how much of that value is actually then redistributed among the deaf community? Unfortunately, that value has not translated down to the deaf individual level. So we know that it's there and it exists, but again, these are connections that are currently non-existent. So we need to figure out ways to tap into that value. Signing is often a very hot topic. A lot of people always express interest in learning it, but a lot of times people who sell courses or who run apps or try to claim that they have expertise in sign languages are often not deaf, often not fluent or native signers. So we need to make sure that deaf people have agency so that our language is not exploited, and that we can be the ones to make sure that deaf people have the opportunity to share our language. So there is motivation and there is interest, but the money doesn't always get circulated among deaf people themselves. So that brings me to a couple of open questions for discussion. One is recognizing the value that we as deaf people and the broader signing community have. We know that app developers, those in the field of technology, are very interested in creating signing avatars and using motion capture technology. This field often ties in a lot to those who are interested in sign recognition and doing automated AI translation. And I understand that there's a great deal of interest in that, but you have to collect a good deal of data. So if you're working in AI, you have to go after data. And one of my major concerns is that I see this other wave of collection of community data, and the community sometimes unknowingly is giving it away, without really understanding the ways in which the community will benefit in the end from giving away this data. There are large tech companies out there that are currently putting out calls for sharing data and asking if we can generate data. So my open question is, how can we figure out the perspective of open payments or web monetization, use those as a way to empower the community to say, sure, I'm happy to give data, to make a video of myself using sign language and share it with someone as a form of data to help with AI, but I want to be compensated for it. So there's certainly a number of ways that that could happen. I don't know the mechanisms for it yet. But the idea of access through AI could be useful. There are upsides to it, but it comes with a number of considerations. And so my ultimate concern is that at the moment, there's such a strong push for it, I think without recognition of the potential downsides. People think that AI translation will solve all kinds of problems so that we don't have to worry about access through interpreters, but AI translation is so far from where that level of quality could be. And so it turns into propaganda that seems nice, but doesn't actually work in reality. My second open question for discussion is, where is the deaf community now? For us to understand how to move forward, we have to have a clear understanding of what our baseline is. Where are we now? What is our value? How do we move from where we are now to a place where we can really leverage that value? What sorts of programs, what sorts of tech should we use to really create that financial equity? So these are two thoughts that are always lingering for me, and that was how I thought I would end my very succinct lightning talk about such a big, relatively complex global picture. Thank you for your time and attention, and it looks like we've got enough time for question and conversation.